Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Will you fasten your seatbelts for takeoff, please? Thank you.
Kia ora, hello and welcome to Sound Salad, where we toss around all things spoken and all things heard. Brought to you by Audiobooks New Zealand, New Zealand's leading producer of audio content.
We hope that you will have a pleasant journey, and if we can add to your comfort in any way, please do not hesitate to press the call bell.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sound Salad. I am here today with wonderful Martin Crump. Now I'm going to read a little bit of a bio just because I should and because I can, before I let him, take us away and regale us. Martin Crump is a writer, broadcaster and MC. He has worked as a radio host for News Talk ZB, Radio Pacific, Radio Live. His feature book, In Search of the Great Kiwi Yarn, 2007, is a collection of thematically linked Kiwi stories and tales. Martin Crump, son of Barry Crump, has also been instrumental in the publication of his father's series for children, Professor Pingwit and the Punga People, 2009. Crump is available to visit schools as part of the Writers in Schools program as well. Now, I don't really need to say a lot of that because I think your reputation sort of precedes you in a lot of ways. And I know you've had a very eclectic array of professions, but perhaps you could give us a little bit of a sort of wander through your CV, I guess. Like how you ended up to become an author, what led you from all of these titles that you had into the direction that you're in.
Hey, well, thanks for having me here. Great to be here. And look, there's no other way around it. It was my father, of course, that has led me to this place right now, whether I wanted to be here or not. It certainly, with a name, it gives you a toe in the door, but it won't last for very long if you haven't got much to offer. So that's exactly where it started. And of course, being the son of, people expect a little something from that. Not all of Crump's sons are storytellers or writers, but I can tell you this, most of them can write. Perhaps a little shy too, because those shoes you want to be a little bit scared of filling because Barry did such a good job. But yeah. I was approached by Horomoa and Beckett to be the front person for a search for the Great Kiwi Yarn, and I thought that was a great idea. Yeah. So I did, and they asked me to write 20 stories of my own, and I didn't know whether I could write. But one thing that I did know is that I used to tell stories a lot to my children. And I did. And whenever the power would go off or anything like that, the children loved that. They'd get candle going, come on, Dad, tell us the stories. And I'd tell them stories. And so I started writing some of those down. 9:30 at night, I'd clear the decks, I'd get a cup of tea going, get my rollies and roll up my rollies because I was smoking in those days. And I'd write them. And the good thing was that my wife, Jill, would be brutally honest, sometimes very hurtfully so, but
nice.
But you have some things you have to know, and stories that work or don't work, what you think may work may not. Yeah. So I started writing down stories that I was telling my children, and that seemed to work. And so I ended up getting some published, and so surprise, surprise, here we go. And I've actually Barry was asked to write a children's story, because he wrote Mrs. Windy Flax and the Punga People, teamed up with Murray Ball from Footrot Flax, and that first story was such a success, the publisher said, can you write 5 more? So Barry wrote 5 more of the Mrs. Windy Flax or the Punga People stories, and it all happened from a pair of little shoes, girls' shoes, that he found at Punakaiki in the top of the South Island, and that's where the Punga People started, because he said they were stolen by the Punga People. And so this is where this started from.
Amazing.
So Barry had actually written and completed and published 4 of the Punga People stories, but then he passed away before he finished the other 2. So I found the unfinished manuscript of Professor Pingwit, the Punga People, and posthumously I finished that off with my father. Sold 15,000 copies, went really well, and it seemed to run quite seamlessly. The 6th story is called Chief Awatiri and the Punga People.
Yes, yep.
And there were about 8 those paragraphs they call stanzas. These things I find out as I go along. So I found out, and there was about 8 stanzas. There's about 36 in the book, but Barry had left about 8 behind. But it was written a little bit funny because that was just what he was doing. It was just an exercise at that stage. So I finished that off, and we've got that one yet to be published. So I finished that, and I'm really happy with it. I reckon it's the strongest of the Punga People. So,
Really?
so these things are what I've done. I've written I've got 2-3 children's stories of my own from past experiences. So children's stories I've written myself, waiting to see if they're going to be published or not as well. I just love telling the stories.
You started to write your own sort of children's sort of literature, I suppose, to get yourself in the headspace to work on the pangapa. Is that right?
Exactly. That's how it started. I went to the zoo with my children because we became friends of the zoo because we lived next door to the zoo.
Right.
And if you don't go during the daytime when all the animals are lying about doing absolutely nothing and you can't be bothered with the tourists because you feel a bit like that, all the people looking through the window, go late in the day. They change completely. So here we are, we're having the most maddest experience at the zoo. Camels running up and down, the hippo is climbing up the cage and batting those huge eyelashes at my baby girl, my little Ollie, in the prams. I've got 3 of my children at that stage, and they're all tiny, and my baby Ollie is in the pram, and the craziest things start happening. This hippo goes mad and starts climbing up the cage and batting the eyelids and swimming up and down and around, and the camel's running up and down, and things are getting quite out of control, and I'm getting a bit concerned. Are we going to make it out? So we sneak out to the Pride Lands, and we're going through the Pride Lands. And by the way, my baby Ollie is a redhead with big freckles, right?
Right.
This is part of the story, and this is true as I'm riding this bike. We're coming up to the Pride Lands. You know the big platforms they've got there?
Yes. Yeah.
Big giraffe comes over, reaches over, and wraps her tongue around my baby Ollie's arm and starts lifting her out of the pram.
No.
I tell you why.
Jesus.
She'd lost her child, and because my baby was a redhead, she started taking my Ollie away, and this was that's the part I am making up. The rest of it's actually quite true. So I did the book Ollie and the Zany Zoo.
Yeah.
And that's how that one started because the animals were behaving a bit crazy that day.
Yeah.
So I've made this whole thing up about Ollie being estranged because of her redhead and in the back of the bus and the bus trip to the zoo, and off we go, and that's that story there.
Yeah. Do you find it I suppose easy is probably the worst word to use, really, isn't it? But I mean, it seems like those sorts of serendipitous ideas, like the little pair of red shoes, like a hippo or a giraffe going a little bit AWOL one day, like those tiny little seed ideas. I mean, they're only moments, they're tiny notions, but somehow, I don't know what it is, either with discipline or with just a very extensive imagination, being able to crack something like that into something that's pretty large and iconic, Like, yeah, I don't know. I love that.
And that's where it starts, that little tiny acorn.
Yeah.
I had a fight with my mother and I'm 8 years of age and I'm living in New Lynn, just up the road here.
Yeah.
And we've had a big scrap, me and Mum. And so I've pedalled off on my bicycle and I've pedalled all the way to Western Springs. And in those days, there was a bit of gravel road involved because I was born in 59, so it's a few years ago.
Yeah.
So we've had this big scrap and I've pedalled off and I got to Western Springs at the back of one of the big creeks that run down the side.
Yeah.
And there I recognise a child who was a bit bigger than me, actually, by the way. He's about 12. He's about a few years older than me. And he was breaking open duck eggs and using the little ducklings as bait to catch eels. It horrified me.
Wow.
I couldn't stand what this guy had. He was a bully and not a very nice person from the area too. Yeah. So while his back was turned, I picked up the last egg out of the nest, a little bit of the nest, stuck it down my jersey, and then pedalled all the way home. Forgot about fighting with Mum and pedalled all the way home again. And I got home and I told Mum, and she told me off for running away, and she said, well, what are you going to do with that? And I said, I'd do something with it. So we put it in the hot water cupboard in the kitchen.
Yeah.
You go on with life as you do.
Yeah.
But 3 days later, we're having dinner, and we're hearing this tap. What's it? Open up the hot water cupboard door, and it's Paddles.
Oh.
Paddles was born. Paddles had fallen about 4 or 5 feet off the hot water cylinder and was on the ground. I don't know how Paddles survived that for a start.
Jeepers.
So I opened up the door, and I was Paddles' mum. So I've still got a photo of Paddles eating warm bread and milk that I'd got for Paddles. We rang the zoo up, Mum did, and she found out you can't keep a wild duck. Paddles lasted 11 days. In reality. Yeah. But in my story, Paddles had a fantastic life with me.
Yes.
And she sorted out that we saw the mean kid in the neighbourhood.
Yeah,
Paddles dropped the lunch on the mean boy's head and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's how the story goes. So I've got a story called Paddles and Me going on, and it all happened from a fight with Mum and an escape to the Western Springs. So these stories are actually in a lot of our childhood or in a lot of in our life, if we want to look at it.
Yeah.
And it's just just your imagination where it takes you after that, and away you go, and how you tell the story.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about how those two stories.
How those came about. Gosh, I love it. I love those little stories. What was I going to... Oh, yes. Next one was a little question that I'm asking everyone, is whether or not they remember their first audiobook experience. Now, it doesn't have to be something from childhood. You could have just heard your first audiobook, perhaps, I don't know, a year ago, who knows. But do you have a recollection of it?
I do, and my stepfather, who was a wonderful man and my good buddy, got a little bit crook later in his life, couldn't see too good, and that sort of thing, reading, and he loved reading, and he loved westerns and war stories.
Yeah.
And we were great mates, my stepfather and I. He was my good buddy, and I remember him lying down on the couch listening to, it might have been War of the Worlds or one of those. And so I ended up lying down on the couch listening to it with him.
Yeah.
And I listened to 2 or 3 books with him that way. And that was the first audio book I ever had to listen to. And I didn't realise how much I enjoyed being told a story to, which I loved. I mean, I was also lucky in my life to be with my father for quite some time. And he was one of the greatest storytellers you'll ever be lucky enough to be in the company of. And I say that apart from being his son, I say that he's a great storyteller, no matter who you are, that he was a great storyteller.
I think a lot of people would probably agree with that.
Yeah, well, and he was good. So, he's left his mark with that, his great stories, which is wonderful. But to lie down there on the couch and listen with my stepfather, Wally, was awesome. And I never forget it. I won't forget it. And that was my first one.
Yeah, gosh, it's interesting, eh? I mean, it definitely, it sort of, for some reason, it feels like a very simplistic thing to do, to just sit and be told a story, But it also does take a significant amount of time to actually listen to a book. So, generally speaking, you are doing it with an elderly family member or with children, or, it's quite sort of seldom, I think, that a lot of people, unless you're in your car, when you can get through about 3 chapters in any generic 8 o'clock morning Auckland traffic.
You're absolutely right about that. I'm hearing a few people that have the audiobooks because of traffic.
Yeah. Yep.
And getting into it that way. So why not? I remember we were struggling when we first put a house on our section. This is my first wife, Adele. And so we had nights with no telly and things like that. And so we had a little like a lamp or something going on, and we'd read to each other, which is another little thing.
So romantic.
Shut up. It's a good way to go to sleep, to have someone read to you. It's such a nice thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, to use, it's great for our children, because we've got so many screens for children these days. For them to actually have to listen and imagine who those characters are and what those characters look like, rather than have them all presented to us. Yeah. That's the other glorious thing about audio, is that you have to imagine the character. And that's what I did with my children, and that's what they still love today. Yeah. Even though they're in their early 20s now, in their early to mid-20s.
Yeah, totally.
They still love it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's something about a captivating storyteller. My granddad is also blind, and I go read to him now because he's a bit deaf too, so he can't really enjoy the audiobook thing, which is a real shame.
And you're reading to him.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's obviously picking up on what you're reading.
Well, yeah, I mean, but also quite similar, it seems, like to your stepfather. Very big on the war content. Yep. Big on westerns. Big on anything. To be honest, big on anything that actually has stakes that are similar to what they lived with. I think, growing up with post, Great Depression and all that sort of stuff. I know that life back then was an incredibly different thing. I know that life these days, particularly for someone in that age group, 93. There's very little that he actually wants to engage in with the loudness of the kind of, modern sort of society that we have. But I think there's something about just having a singular voice in his ear that makes him able to feel sort of, I suppose, a bit less alone in a story. You can kind of, that was what it was. He was talking to me about how he, and he's not got the greatest of memories, but he can remember pretty much every single poem that was ever taught to him at primary school. He left school when he was about 11, not a great childhood, etc. But he remembers every single poem from his teacher. And when I asked him why, he just said, because the guy made it come to life. I remember his gestures. I remember his physicality when he would say these long ballads, you know, like Banjo Patterson type stuff. There's pages of stuff there, you know. But characters and male characters in some really interesting environments that Granddad, I don't think, was used to reading about or hearing about back then, you know. Anyway, it is interesting.
Yeah, and it is. And I'm feeling a little akin with your grandfather because that's a bit like me. I get a bit blurred with too much noise from different directions.
Yeah.
And to have the one voice and to tell me about things that, especially from that era, it would be such a nostalgic trip down there as well, make them feel quite... You could captivate your grandfather, I think, quite well with that. It sounds like you've tapped into him really well, so good on you.
I think so, yeah.
Good on you.
Thank you.
Well,
it's a tricky one.
It
I
is.
think. People's literary taste, which was another question that I was going to come to with you. I mean, obviously, we know that you write a lot of children's literature and things like that, but do you have a favourite genre or style just as a book enjoyer?
I got a hold
as a reader?
I got a hold of the book Papillon by Henry Scherer.
Oh, yeah.
True story.
Yes.
I've since read it 7 or 8 times, and I've read the sequel, Banco, 5 or 6 times, I can promise you. The greatest adventure story ever told, I think, was on the jacket of it somewhere, and I had to agree. It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
The Henry Scherer and Papillon. I've given it to my son, and he's fallen in love with it too.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. My daughters, especially my youngest coming on, has never read any of her grandfather's books, and Barry wrote 24 books.
Really?
Yeah, and she's never read a one. And I've just written a movie script, right? Mm-hmm. Just finished it, and I gave it to my family, and my family really struggled to read any of it. Isn't that funny?
Really?
Yeah. And then I got when they finally got them time, everybody's lives are so busy that people are really struggling with reading right now.
Yeah,
so I gave it to my partner, who's actually selling my movie script, and he still hasn't read it himself.
Really?
Can you believe it? So it's bizarre, isn't it? But I'm finding people in reading something that they're really struggling with.
Yeah.
They'd rather watch the movie or have it read to them.
I know. Well, yeah, just anything to actually absorb the info quicker. And it seems, you know.
Than the chore of reading it themselves.
Yeah.
So this is where audio's starting to play a role as well, I think. You know.
Well, exactly. I mean, the sort of blessing with it, I suppose, is that you can be doing the dishes or driving your car and still achieving it, you know, whereas most of us, if we're lucky, will get the 10 minutes before lights out at night time in bed, and even then it's just a going to bed mechanism, more than, you know what I mean? Like just in terms of the sheer sort of emotional and mental energy that people have for it, I think, a lot of the time. Even when you get really sucked into a really brilliant fiction, you know, I mean, it doesn't actually happen that often anymore, though, you know, like you cannot put something down, you know. I love it. I love it when that happens. I really do.
It takes you on a trip.
Yeah.
It takes you on a journey.
It takes you away from
it
wherever
does.
the hell
Well, it's
you
like
are.
a movie, and I love movies. I really do. And I love being taken on this journey, this roller coaster, whether it be, and I love humour and the likes of that,
Yeah.
but a good story, a good book, very hard to put down.
Yes.
Once you've been picked up by the scruff of the neck and dragged along.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with James Patterson.
Yeah.
It moves so fast across the pages. I've never had anything like James Patterson do that to me.
Wow.
And I'm not a huge reader. But oh my goodness, he took me on a journey. I love James Patterson's The Jester. And what it boiled down to was a romance. It was set in the Crusades of the year of about the 10th, 11th century. But basically, apart from all the blood and the guts and the gory of it all, it was a romance.
Yeah.
And I love that too. Don't we always want the good guy to win? Don't we always want them to get together? You do in the finish.
Yeah,
I think we all
totally.
do.
Yeah.
But I love that. So there's 2 adventure stories that I just loved, and that was Papillon by Henry Scherer, true story, which is fascinating, and then James Patterson's Jester. Now so I think adventure is something that I love, and I love humour. So that's the 2 genres that's really swept me away in my life.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like, I suppose they're the sort of 2 genres that would probably best describe Barry in a way. Like perhaps.
Yeah.
Do we think maybe?
Yeah, definitely. Because a lot of it was well, he stole a lot of people's stories out of the pub, of course, but
Yeah.
a lot of them he had himself, you know.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And he said himself, never let the truth get in the way of a good yarn, you know.
Yeah.
So it had usually they had a little string or little stream of truth in them, because
Yeah.
there's always that. You've always got something that you've got to fall back on.
Well, it always comes from somewhere, right?
Does.
Like we were saying, that acorn or that seed.
Yes.
Like, you know, there's always, you almost owe it to that acorn or seed to make sure that you return to it, I suppose, or that you bring it in there with the substance, you know, throughout the novel, throughout the writing.
I think it gives the story confidence.
Yeah.
Because you're telling it with confidence, because it's got that bit of truth in it.
Yeah.
Because you're telling it from that angle, and it seems to work better that way, doesn't
Yeah,
it? But it looks like it does to me. I was with my father when we knocked around together and had I got to know him quite well over this time, because I never called him Dad, I only called him Barry. He wrote a story while we were together and handed it to me every week when we were playing golf together. And he handed it to me. We spent a night in a quarry on a road called Puha Road in the far north at my brother's wedding. Nice. And I'm sitting on a log in this quarry, and I'm sleeping in the back of my car, and Barry is sleeping in the back of his Volkswagen van that he had at the time. And I'm sitting on this log. It's got quite dark. The wedding's well over, and I'm getting cold and I'm getting hungry. And I daren't go to my car and get a jersey to put on, because I'll break the spell of the story he's telling me. And then I wanted something to eat, and I hate pumpkin, and all he had was pumpkin. But we put pumpkin in the camp oven and swung that over the open fire, and I ate pumpkin, and I loved pumpkin with my cup of tea with condensed milk, while Barry told me these stories. And it was only a week later he started handing me his manuscript, which was written in longhand in an exercise book, and it was called Puha Road, the road that we were actually sleeping in. It was of that road, and it runs onto my brother's property. So,
Right.
so that is the movie script that I've just written,
I was going to ask that. Yeah. So it's Puha Road that's going
that I've written a script for.
forward for. Yeah. Right. Brilliant. Because obviously, I mean, the majority of the country/world will know, I imagine. But for those that don't, the few that don't, Barry also wrote Wild Pork and Watercress, which sort of, I suppose, was the literary basis for Hunt for the Wilder People.
It was. And
Talk to us about that process. How exciting was that?
well, that was incredible, because Barry passed away in 96, so that was a long while later. But I got approached for someone to have the rights of Wild Pork and Watercress. I was with Barry when he was with that little boy, so it was a little autobiographical with a young Maori fella called Kunch, and so you had Julian Dennison on the movie, and of course Barry was the part of Sam Neill. Mm-hmm. So you had these two knocking around together, and I followed them while Kunch drove my father, and Kunch was about 11 or 12, and he drove my father from Pataru to Apotiki. Yes, because my father was drinking, very irresponsible and neglectful. Let's be straight up about that. But I saw them together, and I saw that magic between the two of them. And if that could ever be put on the screen, because the book was fabulous. Yeah. It was a great story, and there's something about a bit of chemistry that happens or whatever. Well, he captured an atmosphere on a page, my father, very well in a lot of books. Some books he wrote was to put petrol in the car and keep moving, to pay some bills, but some were of vital importance too, I think, as New Zealand, to hear these stories put together. And so I was getting these Puha Road manuscripts chapters every week that I'd play golf with Barry, and he said, just proofread it and cross out all the mistakes. There were very few mistakes, but I got so into the story of Puha Road. I loved the story so much that after Hunt for the Wilder People was made, and Taika did such a wonderful job of it,
I agree with that.
was so pleased he did that for us and for New Zealand to tell that story, that I put Puha Road in his letterbox. And in the producer's letterbox to see if they'd like to take that up next. Well, we know what happened to Taika next. At the moment, he's making the latest Star Wars movie. We've lost Taika to Hollywood at this stage. So I couldn't have him for this particular, but I've given it to him, my script.
Great.
And he was very kind about everything that I wrote with it, because what Barry wrote was the book, but it didn't make a movie story. So that means something else. So
totally different, eh?
It is. So that was another little exercise that I've done in my life. Whether it ends up on the screen or not, I don't know. Yeah. But I turned that beautiful story that I was with my father of Puha Road into a movie at this stage, and we'll see what happens. It's with the New Zealand Film Commission at the moment, and we're just waiting to hear. But we've got a producer and a director that really like the script.
Brilliant.
So we'll go from there. But the story itself, I don't know where my father came up with these stories. They were just so good. I mean, Puha Road is about a guy called Muxie, Eric Charles Muxworthy, who has the worst luck in the world, but has the most optimistic, wonderful feel about people, loves people, always so kind, always so generous, but the worst things in the world happen to them. So it's hilarious what happens to him.
We love those stories.
But as bad as his bad luck is, it comes good with the most magical thing. So this one is set in the 1970s, where we had tolls on the Harbour Bridge.
Yeah.
And that's where the luck changes. So watch this space and let's see what happens.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, so that's how that, and to be creative with my father after he's passed away. Yeah. So there's been 2 books and now this movie thing that I've done with my father posthumously.
Yes. I
hope he's all right with it. He's not much he can do with it about it now.
I'm sure he's stoked.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'd be absolutely stoked. My goodness. So there's nothing of Puha Road published, at all? Is there?
The book Puha Road is published?
Yes, right. But the last section. Oh no, right. So the last few chapters you wrote back when he was still alive?
Yeah, no,
right?
He finished it. He finished the book.
He finished it.
He did finish the book Puha Road. It was published in 1982.
Oh gosh, okay, there we go.
I think
I'm well off the mark then.
You published it. So look, a lot of these things and books that are earlier than that, you'd have a lot of trouble publishing them these days because of the talk and the treatment of women and obvious things that were just different back then.
Yeah.
And Barry was a bit rough. Let's be honest, he was violent and rough too. He was a drinker and all sorts of other things, but also a magical storyteller.
Like all of the best, wonderful lowies that we always meet in the bloody clubs and stuff, honestly. I grew up like that, my dad's run nightclubs and now is the president of the RSC, it's like...
I know your dad.
I bet you do.
Yeah.
A lot of people do. In
fact,
they're just very, honestly, the best stories that I have ever heard were between, 6 years old, 11 years old, 13 years old, 17, now, still visiting those places. As soon as there's a couple of drinks in some of those old guys, the colour that comes from them is just incredible. And I'm not advocating, whatever, you go do whatever makes you happy. I'm not saying that it's the healthiest thing that they do or the way that they live, but I tell you what, there is some incredible richness in the conversations that take place in those environments between those guys and the women, all of their, wives, partners, et cetera, but they become living members of the sort of fable fabric of those environments, because a lot of those places are so old, think about, I don't know, how long has the Point Chev RSA been there, or how long has the Grey Lynn Raza been? I don't know. It's been a very long time.
Well, you're talking post-war, so you're talking the late 40s.
Right. Well, there you go.
A long time, and
a long time where a lot of people felt at home in those environments more so than elsewhere, or more so than their own homes a lot of the time as well. I remember Dad telling me all these horrific stories about 6 o'clock swill and all that sort of stuff, and I know that there was a really horrific part of it. But I also know, based on so many jovial, wonderful stories that he's told me over the years, there have been some incredible movies made from those sorts of conversations as well, that we might not even understand that that's where the seed was from, all that kind of stuff. And also people reconnecting after sometimes 50 or 60 years of not having seen each other, and those stories,
Yeah.
like, so whatever happened to that dog you had when you were 6, or what, it just goes on and on and on, and it's a really beautiful thing to be able to bear witness to, and it's something that we don't get often these days anymore either.
Well, you're just a young lady, but you've got it in one. You understand that your dad and your dad's genre of who were sitting down telling those stories, and the 6 o'clock closing. I remember my mum coming into the lounge and she'd do a big twirl, and she'd go, our house in New Lynn was at Communist Party headquarters for Auckland.
Wow.
Frank Sargison, the author was my grandmother's closest friend, and so my grandmother bought the house in 1954. I was born in the house. We had someone that come to stay for a day, and they stayed for a year. Kevin Island was my mum's friend, and so Kevin became, when Barry came out of the bush and when he was 23, he met my mum. My mum had already been married. Mum met Barry in the Vic pub, and he was telling the story of Eskimo Nell. It was a very naughty poem. It's about 60-something verses. My brother and I have since learnt it, and you're not allowed to write it down. You've got to learn it by memory.
Okay.
And if you watch the Toyota ads that my dad was in,
Yeah.
in one of them he's with Scotty and they're sitting on the beach and he's poking the fire and he starts off by going, a few of the boys are whooping it up in one of the Yukon halls, and the guy in charge of the music box he was just starting Eskimo Nell, which you can't tell anymore on television, just not allowed to. And that's where he stopped it. But that's where my mum met my dad. And it was that kind of storytelling, aliveness, 6 o'clock swill.
Yeah.
Pubs were closed at 6, so the parties happened at people's places. So the parties were alive and conversation was alive.
Yeah.
Because 1959, we had no television. It was all parties, and I remember at 5 years of age, Mum's parties were wild.
Yeah.
People everywhere, and there was that marijuana stuff around, and there was all these things happening at my mum's parties, let alone my own.
Yeah.
So my mum's party were wilder than mine.
No, they were naughty, eh? Good Lord.
But they were the literary circle. These were
high educated.
Yeah, these were people, professors of linguistics and anthropology of Mum's friends. We had our blinds painted by really good artists.
Yeah.
Just the blind in the kitchen. So we had this beautiful picture painted by a top artist just in the kitchen. So these were Mum's, that was the lot that was hanging around with my dad and my mum. And so they're the stories that I grew up with. Why wouldn't you carry on telling stories yourself? And you are. You're telling your grandfather stories now.
Indeed.
Isn't that a wonderful thing?
I know, gosh. I know. Generations of them. It's it's I don't know. I think it's wonderful. I love stories. I love them. I'll actually I read a quote of yours, I think, somewhere a while ago, which was, you believe that it is important to record and capture stories before they're lost.
Yeah.
Before they're lost. Yeah. I mean, I feel the same. I think there's nothing better than a bloody good memoir, like a really, really, really good memoir. Just getting a glimpse into a stranger's life or someone that behaved or was perceived differently when than they actually were, to the public or anything like that. I'm a huge fan of them. Do you have in the pipelines anything autobiographical by any chance, or anything like your own sort of memoir that?
Yeah, well, there is
on the cards.
Yeah,
or?
Funny you should say that, because we've just been we've actually been paid the advance already.
We love that.
Yeah, you don't see that much anymore.
No.
Barry's Boys.
Barry's
Boys have been asked to write. Well, actually, we're going to get an author, but I know that my brothers can write, and I know that I can a little too.
Nice.
So we've decided to write what it's like to be born in the shadows, or as the sons of Barry Crump. So that is a book that's being done right now. We're supposed to be finished writing it by October and released next year. So that one's happening as we speak. And so while I'm writing down little bits and pieces, which I'm doing at the moment, it's sitting down on my coffee table at home, of the little bits and pieces that happen, and when was I first aware of who my father was, and it starts from there, and the influence someone like him would have on your life. So the first time I remember seeing him was when we first got our telly, and he was on Town and Around, ripping a wedding dress up to check the oil on the dipstick on the Land Rover that he was driving. He was doing little skits at the time.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What was that called? That show?
Town and Around.
Town and Around, yeah, that's right.
Barbara Magner, Keith Bracey, a whole host of others, and there was and my mum would say, well, that's your father. And the first time I ever remember meeting my father, I was 9 years of age. So I'd only ever seen him or heard about him. And if you go around with a name like Crump in a small town like New Zealand, people are going to say, well, are you any relation? And
yes.
Of course, you've got to put on some sort of show and do a dance if you are. But I remember our birthdays are 2 weeks apart. His 15th of May, I'm the 29th. And he rang up and he said, what's Martin interested in? Ringing up Mum. And she says, carpentry. And he said, well, put him on. And I'm talking to my dad for the very first time, and I'm 9. I'm going,
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a bit of a thing because he was, he was quite well known and things.
Yeah, sure.
So I sort of felt a little bit starstruck, I've got to be honest, myself, never called him Dad or anything. So he says, Martin. I go, yeah. Barry. He goes, yeah. He said, our birthdays, they're right now, so, both together. Why don't we have a night out tonight? I said, fantastic. He said, I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock. I said, incredible. So we hung up. He turned up at 11 o'clock that night with 2 cheeseburgers and a hammer. And
I was going to say, like, okay, so what actually happened?
yeah, 2 cheeseburgers and a hammer at 11 o'clock at night and buggered off. I never saw him for another 5 years.
2 cheeseburgers, like Macca's cheeseburgers.
Yeah, there weren't Maccas in those days.
Weren't Maccas in those days,
no,
right?
Just cheeseburgers.
Oh my God.
But to have him sit on my bed with the 2 cheeseburgers was actually okay, you know, and I didn't feel that aggrieved about it because I found the whole dinner thing with Barry, and he wasn't good as a dad.
Yeah.
And there's a very good reason for that, his own childhood. And once you're armed with that information about where he came from, there's no need for you to be a victim. His upbringing was horrendous. Yeah. My uncle wrote a book called An Endless Fear.
Yes, yeah.
A month after Barry died, Wally died, my grandfather. I've got a Wally that's a stepfather, I've got a Wally that's a grandfather. Mm-hmm. Well, he was a family monster.
Yeah.
And he's not just for the Crumps. There was monsters in a lot of people's families because no one questioned the man of the house.
Yeah, yeah.
And they got away with far too much, like my grandfather Wally did. But Colin told me the story, and Barry only ever said he was a hard old man. Well, he was frightening.
Yeah, yeah.
He was frightening. That book, An Endless Fear, would... So I gave that to all my brothers.
Yeah.
Because I've got 8 marriages between my mother and father, you see, so it makes things a bit interesting. And you're talking about stories and autobiographical. Well, I've started doing the family history a bit. And we're part Russian.
Really?
Yeah, my great-grandfather was Martin. And he was in the Tsar's Navy and jumped ship and came to New Zealand and started a farm. Well, before that, he had a fish and chip shop in 1905 in Taihape and went bankrupt.
Wow.
I've owned my own fish and chip shop.
Have you?
Yeah.
Cool.
So I feel a little akin to Martin, and I've got his chair at home, and it's a beautiful, great big chair. I love the chair.
Wow.
It's an old brown chair. I'll probably get about $10 for it. But the stories that chair can tell.
Yes.
A fantastic guy, my grand. Now, I didn't know his father, but I found out recently who my great-grandfather was. My great-great-grandfather's name was Peter. He was in Estonia, not Russia, they were Estonian. And in 1903, he's 73, and he's fallen off his sleigh, drunk, in the snow, and died. The sleigh kept going. This is the first story of my family story. And I've only just found this out, that my great-great-grandfather, Peter, Enzo, got drunk, 73 years of age, fell off the sleigh and never made it back home because it was in the middle of Estonia in the winter and hello. How about that? So I'm not just going to put the dates and who married who and what children they had. Yeah. I'm actually going to tell the story.
Yeah.
Of Martin and Peter and who came after.
Which is more interesting anyway.
I think so.
You don't want to see a bunch of dates and who begat who and who begat who.
No, because we just don't care.
No.
As children, we don't care. We just don't care.
No.
We can't relate to it. I don't mean to say we don't care. It's something we just can't relate to.
Yes.
But you will relate to Martin, the guy that was in the Tsar's Navy, who yelled charge in Sydney as he left a brothel and picked up a sack of spuds in his teeth when he arrived to Auckland because he was a bit of a showman and did these crazy things. Now, that's the Martin I want to tell you about, not just his date of his birth and his death.
Yes, yeah, of course.
So that's my project at the moment, is doing that family thing and plus writing about being the son of. After Barry died, I did 2 or 3 documentaries and other things, and I ended up, after Barry died, at Barry's funeral, one of his girlfriends came up to me and said, Marty, do you know that when the tall tree falls, it lets light onto all the little trees? And it made me think, ooh, what have I got inside me, I wonder? And it was from that day that I wrote a radio show called Swing the Billy, went to News Talk ZB and got a job. Bill Francis gave me a job at News Talk ZB, and I started the midnight to dawn shifts on Talkback. Didn't know anything about it, and I was terrible for a long time.
I was going to ask that. How do you manage that? I haven't been to study it. I don't know really what I'm doing, but here's an idea. Do you want to buy into it? That's so great, It just doesn't happen like that anymore.
No.
You'd need a 50,000-page treatment and you'd need a lawyer or someone.
Well, that's right. I only had 6 months high school education. I was 14 and I'm out, and I didn't know about computers, and computers run the whole show, so I shut the whole station down one night. I did terrible things. But you know what I really did and what I really connected with is when I started talking to us, to New Zealanders out there. That's when I started feeling at home. And when they started talking to me and we started sharing stories in the night and I became a voice in the night, and I hopefully helped a few people too. And with that, I ended up 14 years in Talkback from that, and just to see what I had inside me.
Yeah.
So communicating is what I do. I'm a communicator, and like yourself, and it's, some people can, and some people would rather be in the coffin than speak at the funeral. That's just how it is. And I'm that other one that doesn't mind.
Yeah.
And I love communicating. I love telling a story. I just hope there's still a platform for it, and that's why audiobooks are important.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I was going to ask, did you find it, were there barriers or anything, to actually stepping away from, say, radio and stepping into literature, or stepping into wanting to be a children's book publisher, for example, doing those big sort of side jumps, they are quite vast in this day and age to be quite, that's a complete industry separation, you know what I mean? Were there any sort of difficulties, or obviously you're saying that you shut down the whole of Radio New Zealand and tried to learn how they worked, or sorry to talk back, the sort of teething period, stepping stone stuff, of you sort of stepping into new territory.
Oh, absolutely. Well, see, Barry had already done it. He had
right. Okay.
He had a radio show called The Bush Telegraph.
Yes, I recall
Radio
that,
Pacific from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. And after 7 a.m. we'd meet at the Waitakere Golf Course and have a round of golf on a Monday to Tuesday, 2 rounds a day. That was after he finished that shift, so I got to meet Gordon Dryden and the people. And and so I had a little toe in the door with that as well. And to be honest with you, it felt a little natural.
Yeah,
for me, I didn't.
I can sense that.
I struggled so much technically with things because the computers do run your station. Like they're recording everything we're doing now.
Yeah.
So I did struggle with that, and I certainly struggled with format and how it was all done. I went on air that first night without any topics. What on earth was I doing? It's because I tell you why I did it, because I hadn't listened to Talkback. I hadn't even really listened to it ever in my life.
Wow.
And went on and did it.
What'd you do?
I just started...
Is there a recording of that?
I hope not.
In the archive somewhere? That'd be so amazing.
I hope not. Oh, I tell you, when I was on air at 11 minutes past 1 on September the 11th, 2001, when that plane hit the buildings.
Far out, gosh.
And I'm finishing work when Paul Holmes is starting. We've got our top broadcaster.
Right. Yeah.
And I'd have a couple of ciggies downstairs with Paul. Well, he's about to start, and he's got a team. He's got a team of 8-9 people, producers and this and that and the other. But Paul's a fantastic. The best part of Paul's show, can I say, is when he's ad-libbing, because he's got every little inch. There's a little pie they do for an hour on radio, and you've got to fill that pie up. And he's breakfast radio, which is the most important, the hardest to do. And he's doing breakfast radio and primetime television morning and night. I don't know how he did it.
Yeah.
But I was with Paul when he fell apart. I was with Paul when he had a marriage breakup. I saw him in all sorts of different places. So good. And I watched how he did. So I learnt off him a lot too.
Yeah, right.
Even when I was feeling terrible, when I was going through something and I had a 6-hour shift to go through on my own, I remember one night you had to put your own out of delay and put a sting on and read your own news, put another sting on, read your own sport, put another sting on, read your own weather, come back into the delay, put a little ad, and then take your own calls while you're on air talking to someone.
Yeah.
You're taking another call to be your next caller. Do that without any technical help. So I learned to do that. That was something I managed. But I did learn from those other people.
Yeah.
About how to do it. Kerry Woodham started the same. Well, she's Kerry McIver now, but she started the same weekend I did, and she's still there.
Oh, of course.
At News Talk CB. So she was really good and helpful.
Yeah.
And gave me whatever she had on her topics that night, would give them to me, and I'd carry on with her topics as well.
Oh, that's so
Until
great.
I learned to do it. But I didn't want to talk about politics. I didn't.
No.
But a lot of people did. I didn't want to talk about all of that sort of stuff. I wanted to know about you. I wanted to know more about the people and your life story and that sort of thing. That's what really got me going.
Yeah, totally.
So, but at nighttime Talkback, you had the luxury of time.
Yeah.
You could spend 10 minutes with someone and actually talk to them and find out about them. And so we became friends to some of them. Some of them I still speak to and talk to now. And I haven't done Talkback for a while.
Yeah.
But voices are as recognisable as a face. I was at my daughter's birthday last Wednesday and somebody said Martin Crump. Never met each other, but he heard me talk.
Yeah.
And it's just through the radio.
Yeah. I know, it's quite interesting how that sort of vocal recognition seems to be really, really acute in people. You'd be able, I I do voice stuff for a couple of different brands and things, and I was at the bakery. I was at the bakery the other day, and I was ordering a pie or something like that, and someone behind me was like, tapped me on the shoulder and was like, "Do you do the thing about that?" I was like, "Oh, yes, I do." And she started asking me about the actual content of the ad, like about the actual like interest rate and, stuff like that, like actual facts about, and I was like, I don't, love, I don't run the company. I just, I stand in front of a microphone and make things sound pretty, like really, really interesting. But, it does harken into that sort of topic or notion that when you've got someone's voice in your ear, they do become a mate, or they become someone that you feel like you've got a real affinity with, even if, and you sort of forget, I think sometimes, that they don't know you. Or that, you'd have no concept of who that person was at that funeral, wedding, sorry, was it a wedding? That you were talking about? The bloke that said, Martin Crump, and they'd never even met you before?
Yeah, that was my daughter's birthday.
Sorry, yeah.
No, exactly, that's right. And it's I worked with Alice Worsley. She was my partner at Radio Pacific for some time. She's got a beautiful voice. I remember driving back from Wellington. I did the Masterton sheep shearing thing.
Oh, yeah.
So I took my producer and I went down there, and we were driving back, and it was Alice on the radio, and I loved it.
Yeah.
It was like a friend, and Alice has got a beautiful voice. She's a funeral celebrant now, and
really?
And wedding one. Yeah, she is so good at it.
I bet.
She's fantastic. She came to Uncle Colin's actually and did Uncle Colin. But yeah, But having a good voice like that in the night, I think, is important. And I used to question what I was doing. I ended up with 5 children under 5, and when you get up in the morning and you've got to stay awake after a big night, it gets quite hard. Do you know what I mean? So you've got to sort of. But then I had a friend and a family member say to me, "Well, you've got to remember you're a voice in the night for some people, and it's doing them some good." And I started seeing that there's a reason for what I was doing.
Yes.
Because those listening could be your nana, granddad.
Absolutely.
So I treated everyone with respect and kindness. And there's people on full moon nights that aren't together, that aren't that well.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm very, very aware of that kind of thing, and still must maintain treating people with respect and kindness because they are us. And I made I felt like there was a worthwhile thing to do, and I like that.
No, I think those sort of, especially in a country like New Zealand, where even if you're in quite a sort of cosmopolite sort of city, you can be quite isolated. Where you can be isolated if you're hermiting in the middle of the Uruweras, but you can also be isolated in the middle of Avondale. We're somewhat of a nation for that, and I think we really do underestimate how much aliveness and how much activity there is in our country in those witching hours. Just genuinely people awake.
There are. There's been a book on them. There's been also
really?
on the overnight people. There's a book on them.
I'm going to look for that because I want to know what the hell that is.
I think that came. Yeah, Barry did a book called The Bush Telegraph. I did a book myself, and everything that the audience wrote in or gave me, I would put that in a book and hand it all back to them. And Barry did exactly the same thing.
Wowee.
Yeah, so
that was all from conversations that you'd had with people, and you just decided to notate it. And
you wouldn't believe where you'd go. One night I remember talking about the Big Bang. Somebody brought up the Big Bang, and I didn't. I only went to school to eat other people's lunch. There's lots I didn't know. Sure. So, but our audience, being bright and alive and knowing things, put it out there, and you've only got to put it out there, and there it is. If you needed to know anything, put it out there. But the Big Bang went for 2 nights.
I bet.
And other things went for a night. I remember having a really quiet time one night in the middle of the night, between 3 and 4 in the morning. So I said, "Look, just indulge me for a second." And I got a couple of chapters of Barry's book out of Fred, and it was about whitebait, catching whitebait on the west coast of the South Island, just out of Hokitika. And it explained everything so beautifully well, like the top of the mountains with little ice cream caps, and he was drying out possum skins on the front of the Land Rover while driving along up the west coast, and just describing everything, that he went into the general store to get something, but he was out the back whitebaiting himself and left the whole store open with the till and everything. But nobody would ever think of touching that because that was the time.
Yeah.
And he described it so well, and I read these 2 chapters out on air, and I said, "Look, if anyone's listening that has some that feels akin to this, give me a call, 0800 80 10 80. There's the number from News Talk CB. How about that? I don't know how that came there, but it did. And I got so many calls from the West Coast people.
I bet.
For the rest of the morning, they were going, oh, yes, and this, and it just did such a nice thing for them. And so they had their morning. Everybody gets a turn.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. I know. It's just having platform, eh? I mean, I think it's tricky in this day and age where we have so much, social media and loudness in that sort of way, Everyone is entitled to publication. Everyone is published. Everyone is a self-publisher. Everyone is entitled to their soapbox, to their rant corner, to their whatever it is that they want to put out into the world to be considered valid or have validated opinions. There's a platform for a lot of those members in that audience, though. They don't engage with those same platforms. So in terms of them getting that same sense of validation or just heardness, like being listened to, and just someone taking an interest in what their little story was that happened 14 years ago with Marjorie out back, or you know what I mean?
The importance of
it's so important.
The importance of a good listening ear is phenomenal. I mean, if you take talkback, there's only less than 1% ring up. Most are listening.
Yes, yeah.
But they're still a very important key to it all, because you actually get a bit of a pulse of what everyone's feeling. I'd start out at night quite often with a very strong opinion on something that may have happened, and I'd soon get talked around by common sense and the truth from people that knew it.
Yes.
And you could hear it. You knew the truth when you heard it pretty much most of the time, and well, hopefully I did. And I'd go home with a totally different opinion, and then I'd be all espousing this and that, the following day, because people had. And that was us again. It was New Zealand, which I love.
Yeah.
More than anywhere, I love this country and the people and the story. I got so many great stories out of this country. We've got a lot. We've got a lot yet to tell.
I know.
And see and watch and listen to in this country. There's such a lot more to tell.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I mean, we've been working so much recently. I finished a project. It was on. Last Sunday, documentary about Centrepoint called From Heaven to Hell, From Heaven and Hell.
Bert Potter.
I played Maggie. That was a fun role. It was a brilliant movie. Thank you, Warner Brothers. It was a divine thing. But I think there are so many people that grew up or were children in and around the sort of 70s or late 60s, 70s. I was sort of growing up, I suppose, in like the 90s and early 2000s, I guess, whereas I think for a lot of those guys that were growing up around that period and they were experiencing a lot of those really massive news stories firsthand, and also a lot of their peers were potentially affected by things like that. There's some incredible stuff that happened in the 70s and 80s in New Zealand, like some of the most incredible stuff that this history ever has happened in those decades, and I think that all of a sudden those young people have grown up with all of the feeling and the fervour in them about whatever happened then, and now they've grown into positions where they're all of a sudden producers, or they are directors, or they are executive producers at places like Māori Television and whatnot, or the head of TVNZ or something like that. So they've placed themselves and worked themselves into positions where they are able now to tell those stories bloody well, Like you could make a low-budget version of whatever those stories were in your 20s or while you're testing your stuff out, but I think those guys strategically saved some of those real big tales till they had the money, the knowledge, the know-how and the people to really nail it, and there's so many that are coming out just, in this year to come. We've got works about the Pacific Panthers, obviously works about Centrepoint. We're rebuilding the whole fantasy sort of section of things, and also utilising a lot more child actors too in a lot of the stories that are being told here now. And obviously with COVID, no one can film anywhere else. So we're it's very difficult for them to, so we're sort of in a wonderful position to, I hope, leverage that to make sure that some of these really incredible New Zealand stories that oftentimes all they do need is just an injection of money.
Yeah.
It's generally just that they've got the people, and they're bloody good people. Film Commission can only afford to fund what it can. CNZ is same position, NZ On Air, all of them are all in the same sort of boat, And oftentimes so many of those projects, it seems, sort of just don't quite make it over the line. But I feel like if there was international interest or I don't know, someone with an international bank account. It would be so much more doable, you know. We're sort of hamstrung a bit here, but I have a lot of faith. We have a lot of hope for our industry, I think, and obviously we're going to have Puha Road to look forward to soon. I'm really excited about that. I hope the rest of the world is too. I bet you are. It's going to be, yeah. I think Taika's got a very, very specific directorial voice and directorial style, you know. I think anything that he does is going to bring a sort of cheeky whirlwind of nuanced humour through it, you know what I mean? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this next one.
It will be.
It'll be really, really cool, yeah. I was going to mention quickly, so I know Audiobooks NZ, they've got like about 3 of your titles up. There's about 15 or so of your father's, but you narrated them all, didn't you?
Yeah, I got my son to do a couple. But
you got your son to do a couple.
Yeah, but I did do them. Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, obviously you've worked in radio, you understand your voice and whatnot, but what was it like narrating Dad's stories?
Well, I can't stand listening to my own voice. I know that. And
really?
I think most people are like that. I don't know. Are you like that? Do you like hearing your own voice? I don't.
I've never really even thought about it as a thing of liking or not. It's always just been work, really. To be honest, you know, I'm just
I remember we'd have to do an air check with the boss and you'd have to listen to your own voice, and I'm thinking, oh, no, I don't like the sound of that very much.
Yeah.
But I like everybody else's. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what was it like narrating? Well, I did. My first one was Wild Pork and Watercress, and I did it in a friend's studio. I didn't do it through audiobooks, but Theo helped me clean all that up.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't done one before. So I actually did an audiobook before I knew about Audiobooks New Zealand.
I love it.
So
cool.
I went and did it myself because I thought there was a good need or a reason for this.
Yeah, totally.
So I read that because it's a great story, and I think, and listen to stories. So what I did find out narrating, how much energy you need, that surprised me a lot, that I needed to get up. I needed to have breaks quite often.
Yes.
To get energy just to talk. But I had voiced the first 2 seasons of Police 10-7.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, God.
So did the first couple of seasons of that. I did the first. I did a program called Strip Search. I did some other voiceover, a little bit of voiceover stuff for the radio. That was part of your job.
Yeah.
So I did a little bit of voiceover work with that as well. So so I'd already had a little start in it, but it did surprise me how much energy you needed and to get up for it and to make it sound right and intonation and to put that in the right place. And there's a little art to it. And as time goes on, hopefully I'm getting a little better at it. So, you just... I think you're great. Well,
I love listening to it. I was listening to it all weekend. I was listening to A Good Keen Man, actually, your narration of that. I loved it. So good. So good. Moving on. I'm very aware of our time. We're over time. Anyway, I'll just ask a couple of other little things. What advice would you give to some young writers out there? I know that's a very big question. So obviously you and the Crump brand, I suppose, are certainly stalwarts, I think, and we've kind of touched on this as well for the re-emergence of a kind of good Kiwi bloke voice.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So my question is, what advice would you give to other young writers, particularly other young men who are still asserting or maybe are still sort of finding their voice in the really tiny industry that we have, particularly in the current climate?
Well, good, really good question. And where do you start? And I think you and I touched on it nearly an hour ago whenever we started.
Yeah.
And that was do something that you're familiar with. Get that thing that story, like I had a fight with my mum and pedalled all the way and got the egg and that became Paddles and Me. Those sorts of things. Get something that you can draw on that actually has some truth to it or something that you know of. And that will help you to get started. Get some bullet points and then try and engage, what would you like to hear? I think go to what you would like to have to listen to yourself. And then start with that. It's a bit. I'm a cook actually. So what do I like to eat? I've got to do that first before I start giving that to anybody else.
Yeah.
So it's the same with a story. That's how I would do it. I would get something that I'm very familiar with, and I'd start writing down the bullet points of that, and then put it into some sort of format that starts to work. And you'll be surprised where you may end up, because I didn't know that I could write until I was asked to.
Yeah.
And then I found out that I could.
Yeah, the rest is history.
Yeah, I just didn't know. And it turns out, yes, I can. I'm okay at it. I wouldn't say that I'm great at it, but I've turned my hands to a few things. I don't want to be my father at all.
Yeah.
I'd like to be Martin and not Barry Crump's son at times, and we manage that.
Yeah.
And, you know, you move on. There's a new generation of people around that have never heard of him, you know what I mean? But
Totally, yeah.
he's left his mark, and it starts with a little pair of shoes or a whatever, or a little something, and your story can start.
I love it. I love it. Beautiful. Well, I think we're probably going to have to call it a day there. I think we've touched on everything that I really wanted to touch on, but I'm sure that we could, you know, I could sit here and talk with you for another 4 hours easily. But what I'll do is I'll finish us off. I'll just double check though. How can people get in touch with you? Or, for example, educators who might like to get you to visit their school or institution or anything like that. How can people find you? Is there a website?
Yeah, well, there is. And my phone number is on the website, and it's barrycrump.com.
Great.
And so my phone, so if anybody needs something to do with the old man or the Crump, because I take care of the Crump Trust, which is you know, all things to do with that kind of thing. So that's part of what I do. And if anybody's got an inquiry or anything like that, just give us a bell or type something into the website, and we'll get a hold of you.
Amazing.
No trouble.
Brilliant. Well, I will be putting all of that for you all into the show notes underneath the episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin. Honestly, it was such a pleasure to finally get a chance to meet you and to get a chance to talk with you.
I've enjoyed you. Your company's been wonderful, so thanks for that, and good to be here.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you again next time.
Thanks a lot for joining us. I'm Romy Hooper. You've been listening to Sound Salad, for all things spoken and all things heard. To hear more Sound Salad episodes, go to www.soundsalad.co.nz. This has been brought to you by my gold sponsor, Audiobooks NZ. Check out their library at www.audiobooksnz.co.nz.
We hope that you will have a pleasant journey, and if we can add to your comfort in any way, please do not hesitate to press the call bell.